In July 2019, Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán was flown to Colorado, once the most powerful cartel boss on earth. He now found himself in a cell at ADX Florence, the prison officials call the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The door slammed shut, and with it, the outside world disappeared. Imagine being locked away like this for 10 years. When you finally step back into sunlight, the world feels too loud, too bright, and too fast. A handshake feels invasive, laughter feels threatening, and even freedom feels like another kind of prison. This is the reality of life after ADX Florence. And the question is simple but terrifying. What does a decade of isolation really do to the human mind? The Supermax experiment. When ADX Florence opened in 1994, the government promised it would control the men too dangerous for ordinary prisons. Ramzi Yousef, who orchestrated the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was sent here. Terry Nichols, who helped plan the Oklahoma City bombing, was locked in too. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, would spend his final years inside these walls before his death in 2023. Each man was placed in a concrete box not much bigger than a bathroom. They ate alone. They exercised alone. They saw only the sky through a 4-inch slit in the wall. For 23 hours a day, there was nothing but silence. Robert Hood, the former warden of ADX, later admitted bluntly, "It's not designed for rehabilitation. It's designed for control. The silence that consumes." In 2013, lawyers brought the case of Bacote versus Bureau of Prisons, describing how prisoners in ADX were losing their minds. One inmate, Jack Powers, wrote that he heard voices whispering to him in the dark, telling him to hurt himself. He would smear food on the walls, scream into night, and beg for human contact that never came. Another prisoner reported seeing shadows walking across the floor of his cell, even though he knew no one was there. Psychologists call this sensory starvation. When the brain has nothing to process, it begins to invent its own reality. The silence inside ADX does not feel peaceful. It feels like drowning, the vanishing of time. There are no clocks in ADX Florence. Lights dim at night, but never fully go dark. Days blur into weeks, weeks into years. Some prisoners count their meals to keep track of time. Others carve marks into the wall, only to discover they miscounted by months. In 2015, a lawyer visiting one prisoner reported that the man thought it was still 1999. In truth, more than 10 years had already slipped away. Time in ADX doesn't move forward. It loops endlessly, like a clock with no hands. Silverstein's shadow. Perhaps no name embodies the reality of permanent isolation more than Thomas Silverstein. After killing a guard in 1983, he was held in near total isolation for 36 years. Much of it was at ADX Florence. Before his death in 2019, he described his existence as a slow, torturous death. For decades, he saw no one except guards. He grew old in silence, watching his mind fade away. His case became a symbol of the hidden cost of extreme isolation, proof that ADX doesn't just cage the body, it cages the human spirit. Freedom that doesn't feel free. In 2018, human rights groups interviewed men who had been released after long terms in ADX and other Supermax units. The findings were chilling. One man walked into a supermarket and immediately panicked at the colors, the music, the crowd of strangers. He left with nothing but a loaf of bread. Another refused to sleep in a bed, instead curling on the floor against a wall, because it felt safer, more familiar, more like the cell he had lived in for 10 years. Families often describe reunions not as joy, but as shock. One mother said when she hugged her son after his release, he froze in terror. He had forgotten what human touch felt like. Freedom, for these men, did not mean release. It meant carrying the prison with them into the outside world. The haunted mind. Scientists have studied the brains of men who survived long-term solitary confinement. They found shrinkage in the hippocampus, which controls memory. They found overactivity in the amygdala, the part that fuels fear and paranoia. In other words, the brain itself begins to change shape under isolation. Lawyers who visit ADX describe a look in prisoners' eyes, distant, hollow, as if they're there physically but not mentally. Families say it too. When he looks at me, It feels like he's looking through me. Even after release, many whisper to themselves at night. They keep TVs or radios on constantly, unable to stand silence. Some pace in circles for hours, just as they did in their cells. It is the invisible cage carried inside forever, the debate that never ends. The United Nations declared in 2015 that solitary confinement beyond 15 days should be considered inhumane. Yet in ADX Florence, men remain in solitary for decades. The U.S. government defends it as necessary for safety. Human rights groups call it psychological torture. For the men inside, the debate does not matter. They live it, year after year, in silence. The question that haunts. So what does life after 10 years in ADX Florence really look like? For some, it is panic attacks and paranoia. For others, it is sleeping on the floor or whispering to themselves to fill the silence. For nearly all, it is a feeling that freedom is not truly freedom at all. And it leaves us with one final question. When a person finally walks out of ADX Florence after a decade in isolation, are they really walking out at all, or are they still trapped inside? The case of Jack Powers. In 2001, a man named Jack Powers entered ADX Florence. He wasn't a terrorist or a cartel leader. He had been sentenced for bank robbery. But inside ADX, he quickly became something else. A test subject of what extreme isolation does to a human mind. Powers spent more than a decade in solitary confinement. He began hearing voices. He hallucinated shadows moving across the floor. He once wrote that he saw figures walking through the walls. He attempted suicide repeatedly. In one letter smuggled to his lawyer, he confessed, "I scream to remind myself I exist." In 2013, his story became part of the lawsuit Baco versus Bureau of Prisons, which accused ADX of violating the Constitution by holding mentally ill prisoners in conditions that only worsened their suffering. Psychologists testified that ADX was not a place of safety, but a machine that manufactured insanity. Jack Powers was eventually moved out of ADX, but even after release, he admitted that the voices never left him. They followed him into freedom, whisper in the quiet, reminding him that a decade in ADX had rewired his mind forever. The world according to Ramzi Yousef. When Ramzi Yousef masterminded the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, he was only in his 20s. When he was convicted and sent to ADX Florence in 1998, the world outside still ran on payphones and floppy disks. Now, after more than 2 decades in solitary confinement, the world has changed beyond recognition. Smartphones, social media, entire wars and political shifts have come and gone, all while Yousef paces inside his concrete cell. In rare letters, he has described how he spends his days walking in circles, counting steps, sometimes for hours. His only view of the outside world is a thin strip of sky. Prison staff say he shows signs of obsession, clinging to rigid routines to avoid mental collapse. For Yousef, life after 10 years, after 20 years, inside ADX isn't measured by freedom. It's measured by footsteps, scratches on the wall, and the sound of his own breath. His punishment is not just a loss of liberty. It's the erasure of time itself. The invisible prison after release. In 2018, the American Civil Liberties Union published testimonies from men released after long solitary confinement. Their words reveal a terrifying truth. The prison doesn't end at the gates. One man said he could not walk into a shopping mall without collapsing from panic. The colors, the noise, the sheer number of people felt like an attack on his senses. Another confessed he could not handle silence anymore. After years of craving sound, he now needed a TV running constantly in the background, even while he slept, to keep from feeling that ADX silence again. For others, it is social connection that proves impossible. A man who spent over a decade in supermax confinement told his wife that he could no longer look her in the eyes. He said, "Eye contact feels like danger. I can't hold it." Psychologists describe this as institutionalized PTSD. The brain adapts to isolation so deeply that ordinary life becomes overwhelming. In this way, ADX follows men into freedom, creating invisible cages no key can unlock. Silverstein's legacy. When Thomas Silverstein died in 2019, he had become a legend of American solitary confinement. For 36 years, he lived without human touch. He aged from a young man into an old one inside a box of concrete. Before his death, Silverstein described his world in haunting words. It's a slow, torturous death, where you're buried alive in cement. You don't exist anymore. You're a ghost. His case was often cited by lawyers and human rights groups as proof that America's supermax system was not about justice. It was about erasure. When Silverstein died, he had spent more time in solitary than almost any prisoner in U.S. history. And though his crimes were brutal, his punishment created a chilling precedent. If the state can lock away one man for life without touch, it can do it to others too. Silverstein's death left a question that still hangs over ADX Florence today. Is this justice, or is it something darker? El Chapo in the Rockies. On July 19th, 2019, Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán arrived at ADX Florence. Just months earlier, he had been sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years for running the Sinaloa cartel. The man who once escaped Mexican prisons through tunnels and bribes now found himself in a place designed so no one could ever escape. For El Chapo, who once commanded armies of men and lived in sprawling compounds, the transition was brutal. He now spends 23 hours a day in a single cell. His meals are delivered through a slot. His recreation is a small cage with concrete walls. His lawyers complained that he was being kept in harsh, unjust isolation. They argued that the U.S. government wasn't just trying to imprison him. It was trying to erase him. Officials responded that ADX was the only place secure enough for a man who had escaped twice before. El Chapo's life after 10 years, if he lives that long in Florence, will not be the story of a kingpin behind bars. It will be the story of a man buried alive in silence, his empire reduced to a cell, families left behind. For every man inside ADX Florence, there's a family outside who feels a punishment too. In 2015, the wife of a prisoner testified that her husband had stopped speaking to her during visits. He would sit silently, staring at the floor. After years without conversation, he had forgotten how to use words. Their daughter, who had been a child when he was sentenced, grew up without hearing her father's voice. Another family reported that when their son was finally released after more than 10 years in isolation, he refused to attend gatherings. He would leave the dinner table and lock himself in his bedroom, unable to process the chaos of family life. Prisoners aren't the only ones who live with ADX. Their families carry the silence too, the science of destruction. In 2014, neuroscientists studied the brains of men who had endured long-term solitary confinement. MRI scans revealed shrinking in the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory and learning. At the same time, the amygdala, the part that controls fear, became hyperactive. In plain terms, the brain rewired itself for paranoia. Doctors compared it to the damage seen in war veterans who suffer from severe PTSD. But unlike a battlefield, this trauma came not from violence or chaos, but from the absence of everything. One psychiatrist who testified in Cunningham v. BOP said bluntly, "Solitary confinement is not just psychological pain. It is brain damage." And yet, ADX continues to operate. The haunted eyes. Lawyers, journalists, and even guards who have met ADX prisoners all describe the same thing: a look in the eyes. Distant, unfocused, as if the man in front of them is not fully there. One mother said of her son after his release, "When he looks at me, it feels like he's looking through me." This vacant stare is not a sign of defiance. It is a scar. It is the mark left by years of isolation, by days with no voice, by nights with no human presence. It is the haunted look of a man who left the cell, but whose mind is still trapped inside. The debate that never dies. Human rights groups call ADX Florence a violation of basic dignity. The United Nations declared in 2015 that solitary confinement beyond 15 days is cruel, inhuman, and degrading. Yet in Florence, men spend decades in it. The U.S. government insists it is necessary. Officials point to men like El Chapo, who once escaped Mexican prisons, and argue that ADX is the only way to guarantee public safety. Former wardens counter by admitting the truth. The prison is not about rehabilitation. It is about control. And so the debate continues, while the men inside grow older, their lives measured in whispers, hallucinations, and endless pacing. The final question. So what does life after 10 years in ADX Florence really mean? It means stepping into freedom, but carrying the silence with you. It means fearing eye contact, panicking in crowds, whispering to yourself at night to fight the ghosts of your cell. It means families reuniting, but realizing they are hugging a stranger. The real punishment of ADX is not just the years taken away. It is the way those years change a person forever. And that leaves us with one question that echoes through every chapter of the story. If isolation destroys the human mind, why do we continue to build prisons designed to erase it? The man who forgot how to speak. In 2012, a lawyer visiting ADX described an encounter that still haunts him. He sat across from a prisoner who had been in solitary for over 10 years. When the lawyer asked a question, the man's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stuttered, stopped, tried again, then simply shook his head. He had forgotten how to carry a conversation. Speech is a skill shaped by interaction. Without it, language begins to unravel. Words feel foreign. Sentences collapse halfway through. The man finally whispered, "I don't remember how." When he was eventually transferred out of isolation, he still struggled to talk to people. He spoke in short, broken phrases, like a child relearning a language. His decade in ADX had not just silenced him, it had erased his voice. Terry Nichols and the Endless Quiet. Terry Nichols, sentenced for his role in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, has been inside ADX Florence for decades. For years, little was known about his daily existence, until court filings revealed the monotony of his life. Nichols spends most of his time reading or writing. He has no cellmate, no social interactions, no television beyond government-approved programs. When he does exercise, it is alone in a small cage. Attorneys who reviewed his conditions argued that even for a man convicted of horrific crimes, this punishment was extreme. They noted that after more than a decade in isolation, Nichols had grown increasingly withdrawn, barely able to hold even short conversations. For him, the outside world has already vanished. His reality is silence, repetition, and the slow fading of time, the lawsuits that tried to break the silence. In 2012 and again in 2015, lawsuits were filed against the Bureau of Prisons, challenging the conditions at ADX Florence. Cases like Cunningham v. BOP revealed chilling details. Prisoners with schizophrenia screaming through the night, men smearing food or waste on their walls, others attempting suicide with whatever scraps they could find. Federal judges acknowledged the evidence. Experts testified that ADX was not simply punishing inmates, but actively destroying their mental health. Yet despite the lawsuits, ADX remained unchanged. One attorney said it best. Even if the courts acknowledge the damage, the walls of ADX remain. The lawsuits may have cracked the door open, but for the men inside, the silence still suffocates. Ted Kaczynski's final years. Ted Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber, spent more than 2 decades in ADX Florence before his death in 2023. For years, he lived in near total isolation. His writings from prison reveal a man consumed by routine. He described waking at the same time, eating the same meals, pacing the same steps. Despite his crimes, his years in ADX showed the same pattern seen in countless others: withdrawal, obsession, and the shrinking of his world into 4 concrete walls. When news of his death broke, some noted that Kaczynski had not died only in 2023. A part of him had already been erased long before, buried under years of silence. When freedom feels like another prison, psychologists who treat men released from ADX report a disturbing pattern. Freedom often feels unbearable. One man described his first trip to a city after release. The sounds of traffic, the chatter of strangers, the flashing lights, all of it felt hostile. He said he wanted nothing more than to return to his cell, to the safety of the silence he had once hated. Another could not hug his own children. The touch overwhelmed him. His family saw the pain, but they also saw the distance, as if the man who came home was not the same man who had left. In this way, ADX created a paradox. Men long for freedom, but once it comes, they find themselves unable to live in it. the guard's perspective. It is not only the prisoners who are affected. Guards who have worked inside ADX describe the atmosphere as oppressive even for them. One retired officer told a reporter in 2016, "You can feel the silence pressing on you. It's not normal. It's like working in a morgue." Some guards admit they rarely spoke to the prisoners beyond orders, not because they were forbidden, but because the silence had become part of the culture. Over time, even staff began to feel the weight of isolation. Depression, anxiety, and stress were reported among officers. ADX doesn't just shape prisoners. It shapes everyone who steps inside. The cycle that never ends. For many prisoners, 10 years in ADX is not the end. It is the beginning of another kind of isolation. Some are transferred to lower security prisons, but by then, they have already lost the skills to adapt. They withdraw, avoid contact, and sometimes request a return to solitary. Others are released outright. But they carry invisible scars, panic attacks, paranoia, and a constant need for routine. They live in the world, but not truly of it. The cycle is cruelly simple. Once the mind has been shaped by ADX, it cannot be fully unshaped. The question of justice. Supporters of ADX argue it is necessary. They point to men like El Chapo, who once escaped prisons in Mexico, or terrorists who orchestrated mass killings, and they insist that only ADX can keep the public safe. But critics ask a different question. At what cost? If 10 years in ADX erases the mind, if freedom becomes another prison, then what kind of justice is being served? In 2015, a United Nations official declared that prolonged solitary confinement is a form of psychological torture. Yet in Florence, Colorado, it continues. The debate is not about whether men like El Chapo or Ramzi Yousef deserve punishment. The debate is whether a society can justify a system that doesn't just punish crimes, but erases the human being behind them. The question that remains. So what does life after 10 years in ADX Florence look like? It looks like a man walking into freedom, but carrying prison inside him. It looks like a family reunion, where hugs feel terrifying. It looks like panic in a grocery store, silence in a bedroom, pacing in circles in the dark. The men may leave ADX, but ADX never leaves them. And the haunting question remains. If we build prisons that erase the mind, are we protecting society, or are we creating ghosts who walk among us? The hidden cost of silence. By 2018, human rights investigators had collected testimony from families of men released after long terms in ADX Florence. What they found was alarming. One man had been freed after more than a decade of silence, yet he could not hold a steady job. He would sit in his apartment, lights off, pacing for hours as if still trapped in his cell. When asked why, he told his parole officer, "The world is too loud. My room feels safer." Another former prisoner described walking into a grocery store and nearly collapsing from sensory overload. The bright lights, the beeping registers, the chatter of families. It was too much. He abandoned his cart and fled, saying later that the aisles felt like a carnival of chaos. The hidden cost of ADX is not just measured in the men still inside. It is measured in the men who come out carrying silence within them. It is measured in families who find strangers returning home. And it is measured in a society that must decide whether such silence is protection or destruction, the experiment that never ends. Psychologists describe ADX Florence as a kind of experiment, one that was never written into law, but continues every day behind closed doors. Since its opening in 1994, ADX has tested the limits of human endurance. What happens when men live years without touch? What happens when days blur into weeks, weeks into decades? The answers are clear. Hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, social collapse. And yet, the experiment goes on. New prisoners arrive. High-profile names like Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán, locked away in 2019, join the ranks of men like Ramzi Yousef and Nichols, whose lives have already been stripped down to silence and routine. There are no official research papers stamped by the Bureau of Prisons, but there doesn't need to be. ADX itself is the study. Every step taken in its corridors, every scratch marked into its walls, every whisper heard in the dead of night is data in an experiment that never ends. The final echo inside. Imagine standing at the door of freedom after 10 years inside ADX Florence. The metal groans, the outside light floods in, and for a moment, it feels like rebirth. But then the panic hits. The voices of strangers feel too sharp. The colors of the world look wrong. Even the open air feels like a threat. Some former prisoners describe wanting to retreat immediately back into a cell. The isolation they once despised becomes the only reality they know. Freedom, instead of a blessing, feels like another punishment. This is a final echo of ADX Florence. It teaches men to survive silence so completely that they cannot survive anything else. The cell leaves the body, but it never leaves the mind. The families who wait in silence. For every man in ADX Florence, there is someone waiting outside. A mother who sends letters that go unanswered. A child who grows up without hearing a father's voice. A wife who visits year after year, only to see a man more withdrawn each time. In 2015, during the Cunningham v. Biopi case, families testified about the toll. One woman described how her husband, after more than a decade in solitary, no longer looked at her during visits. He sat silently, staring at the floor. Their daughter had grown into adulthood without ever hearing him laugh. When men finally come home, the silence does not end. Families speak of dinners eaten in wordless rooms, of embraces that feel alien, of relationships broken beyond repair. The punishment does not stay inside the walls of ADX. It spreads into every home connected to those walls. The mirror of a nation. The debate about ADX Florence is not simply about crime or punishment. It is about what kind of society builds a place designed to erase the human mind. Supporters argue that men like El Chapo or Ramzi Yousef deserve nothing less, that their crimes demand control beyond ordinary prisons. Critics counter that a decade in solitary does not just punish, it dehumanizes. And when a nation dehumanizes, it reflects something back about itself. The United Nations has called solitary confinement beyond 15 days inhumane. Yet in Florence, men spend decades. The U.S. government defends it as necessary. But the world watches, and the question lingers. Do these walls protect America, or do they reveal its darkest instincts? ADX Florence is more than a prison. It is a mirror, and what it reflects back is not only the faces of the men inside, but the values of the country that keeps them there. The prison you can't escape. The story of ADX Florence is not just about concrete and steel. It's about silence turned into punishment, and punishment turned into erasure. It's about men who enter with crimes and leave with scars that never heal. It's about families who wait for loved ones who return as strangers. For Thomas Silverstein, it was 36 years of shadows. For Ted Kaczynski, it was a final chapter written in silence. For El Chapo, it is the daily reality of a king stripped down to a cage. And for countless others, it is a question of whether they will ever walk free again, not just outside the prison walls, but inside their own minds. And so, in the end, ADX Florence is not only a place in Colorado. It is an idea that freedom can be taken not only from a body, but from a mind. The haunting truth is this. The men may leave the prison one day, but the prison never leaves them. And that leaves us with one final question. A question not about them, but about us. If isolation destroys the human mind, what does it destroy in a society that chooses to use it?